right. Gavin, first, thank you so much for finding the time to come down and have a chat with us. It is so awesome to have you here.
Not a problem. I'm happy to be here. Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it.
So for anybody who doesn't know, I thought maybe we could do like just a very brief overview of like who you are, what you've done, past projects, all the way from like My Beautiful Paper Smile and what most people probably know you for, Choo Choo Charles, and getting announced at the Game Award for your new game Cuffbust. Like, it's quite a ride. It's quite an escalation path that you're on. It's really amazing to see a solo dev coming so far so fast. So like, if you want to just give us a brief overview of like how that got started.
Thank you. Yeah, for sure. So first of all, I would be kind of curious. How many people are familiar with like Choo Choo Charles or any of that stuff at all? A couple folks here and there. Okay, cool. Yeah, so a little bit of background. I'm Gavin. I started game development when I was 12, and I'm 23 now, so I've been making games for a little over a decade. Started out on the Blender game engine, was messing around with that for a little while, got into Unreal shortly after that. Started making some small mobile games, published a couple small things here and there. Later on in high school, I made a game called My Beautiful Paper Smile that I spent about 3.5 years on, released that to a moderate reception. It did okay, but I wanted to try and make something that could get more visibility and turn game development into more of like a full-time job for me. And so at that point, I made Choo Choo Charles, which came out a couple years back now, I think about 2 years ago now. Went pretty viral across social media and did pretty well. That kind of got me into my current project, Cuffbust, which is a multiplayer prison escape game that I announced at the Summer Game Fest this past June, I think. And so now I'm just working on that, getting that prepped for release. And that's kind of where things are at.
Yeah, I guess. One thing I thought was interesting is like, could you explain like maybe the thought process of like coming up with the idea for Choo Choo Charles?
Sure, yeah. So at the time, so I was coming off of the release of My Beautiful Paper Smile. That game, for a little bit of context, is sort of a 2.5D point and click walking simulator sort of game. It got a little bit of attention on YouTube, but I was seeing that the attention, it wasn't snowballing like I thought it could. I was trying to make something that could go viral. I was trying to play off of themes that I was seeing in games like Bendy and the Ink Machine and Five Nights at Freddy's and stuff like that. But for My Beautiful Paper Smile, it just wasn't working. The conversion rates weren't very good. The virality wasn't really there. And so for my next game, I decided that it seemed like a lot of the things that were leading a lot of these other games to become successful was characters, strong characters, and specifically nostalgic characters and unique environments, things like that. Like you see in Five Nights at Freddy's, Bendy and the Ink Machine, Tattletale, a lot of other these similar sort of viral horror games. And so I started trying to think of characters that would be kind of nostalgic and familiar to people that I could base an entire game around. And so using that idea of a nostalgic character as kind of the core of a game, I started thinking about kids' TV shows. I was like, well, that's kind of nostalgic, right? There's plenty of kids' TV shows out there, and most people would have watched them as kids. Therefore, it's kind of nostalgic. And so for me growing up, one of my favorites was Thomas the Tank Engine. I was like, hey, trains are cool. Why not do something with trains? So that was kind of the initial spark for that. And then coming out of that, I kind of started crafting some more train-based gameplay mechanics, like the open world traversal and things like that, that I thought would be just more interesting from a gameplay perspective.
Can you tell me your thoughts on like announcing a game? So like, is the initial announce really important, or like, I've talked to people who work in YouTube and they say like, if a YouTube video doesn't do well, you can post it again. like redo it and post it again? And like, is the same true of a game announcement, or is that a little more like something you can only do once?
I think it's technically something that you could. It is possible that you could announce a game and it not do well the first time, and then maybe later on when you release the game, it does really well. That's not usually how it goes. Typically, your initial announcement is going to be very, very telling of the overall success of the game. But there are a lot of games, you know, probably the most known example would be something like Among Us, where it's like, you know, they put out trailers for it. They had announced it. People knew about it. And it didn't do well. And it wasn't until it got into the hands of streamers that it was really able to be shown off in the most enticing light. There are some games that they're very difficult to describe in the context of a trailer or short form content or devlogs, things like that. But once they're in the hands of players, they can start spreading through word of mouth, good reviews, social proof, and things like that. So it's a telling sign if your announcement isn't going well, but it doesn't necessarily doom you. It's kind of, it depends on the game.
So just a follow-up question on the topic of, can you do it again? Did you want to do it again? Because you had a bit of a different strategy. Getting discovered by Jeff Keighley and invited to one of the biggest events in the world in games. Like, if that hadn't happened, and also I'm really curious, how did the cat get out of the bag? Like, who among your friends knew about the project, and how did that make its way to the top where you were discovered? And if that hadn't happened, would you have wanted to announce your new game the same way as Charles?
So I guess I might need clarification on the question because I'm kind of stupid like that. But okay, so as in, would I announce Cuffbust the same way that I announced Choo Choo Charles?
Yeah.
If not for Summer Game Fest.
Correct.
Yeah. So if not for Summer Game Fest, I definitely would have done pretty much the same thing that I did. And it wouldn't have gone as well. It wouldn't have gone as well as it did with Choo Choo Charles. Choo Choo Charles is a game that it's very instantly captivating. It's, you know, the character, and you know, you can watch a 5-second clip and it'll just be really like kind of in your face engaging. So it's an immediately viral kind of concept. With Cuffbust, it's one that I don't think, it doesn't explain itself as well, so it's more difficult for it to go viral. The characters, they're interesting, they're recognizable, they're decently well branded, but they're not necessarily viral on their own. When paired with, you know, a personality from, you know, a live stream or a YouTube video, I think it'll have more potential. But it's kind of one of those sort of things. Oh yeah, there they are. Yeah, so with Summer Game Fest, I still don't exactly know how Jeff found out about it. I'd been posting some teasers on like Twitter. I don't know if he saw that. I don't know if some folks from his team saw that, but at some point he saw something, I guess, and reached out. He's like, "Hey, I heard you're working on a new game. Can I see it?" And I was like, "Oh, sure, why not?" So showed it off to him, and he was like, "Yeah, that's cool. We should announce it." So that ended up just being a natural, like.
So it wasn't a complete secret.
Not a complete secret. It was public
There's
that I was working on something, but yeah, that was about it.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask. Is just like, could you put out a trailer without doing any sort of like pre-marketing for it, or do you have to put it out like after you've already kind of like made videos about the game somehow?
I mean, you can kind of do it. However, I think the main thing is just that. I mean, I guess it also depends on what the strategy is. For my strategy, my goal is to go viral. My goal is to take advantage of the algorithms and let those push my content as much as possible. You know, the main reason that I waited, because I waited about a year. I was in development for about a year on Cuffbust before I announced it. And that was mostly just out of necessity because I didn't exactly know what I wanted the game to be in every aspect. I didn't know exactly what the visuals should be like. I didn't know exactly what the tone of it should be. I had a general idea, but it wasn't all there. So I kind of had to just wait a while until I kind of had a good feel for it. And then that'll just kind of happen to line up well with the Summer Game Fest and when I started working on the trailer and all of that.
Speaking of tone and specifically art style, they both have a very distinct style, but they're really different. Like almost as different as the difference in how these two games were announced and like brought to the world. One was like primarily just word of mouth, getting it out there, getting that viral spike on social media, and the other one was on a global stage. So two different marketing environments and also two different art styles. Did you have anybody not know it was your game? Like, was there any confusion because they look so different?
I don't know. I don't know exactly. I mean, I think if my name wasn't attached to Cuffbust, people probably wouldn't recognize it as being one of my games because there really aren't that many similarities, if any. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure there are some people who have been confused.
You don't think that's a problem, though? I mean, like,
no, it is. Well, sort of. So, from an audience conversion standpoint, it's definitely a problem. You know, I've got my YouTube channel and I've got all these subscribers that have been following me for Choo Choo Charles. A lot of them aren't interested in Cuffbust. And it's like from a YouTube perspective and from an audience conversion standpoint, it's not great. You know, my goal in this was not necessarily to try and keep the YouTube channel going. It was more so trying to make a game that I thought would have better chances on launch for longevity and things like that. Choo Choo Charles, just in the way that it's formatted, it's more linear, less replayable. The horror genre also just has a naturally smaller appeal than something hyper colorful like this. And so my main decision point here was just like, okay, I'm going to try and make something that can reach a broader audience. And unfortunately, that meant having to make a pretty sharp turn in just my overall company branding and everything. But hopefully, it's a better long-term decision.
Was that a consideration when you were transitioning to working on Charles from your other games? Because you've worked in like almost, I guess you could describe it as like a Myst style game. And you've also done a game that's primarily hand-drawn. So you're kind of working your way through a bunch of different styles. Was that a concern when you were going to Choo Choo Charles, or is that more of a more recent thing now that you have such an audience? It might be a consideration to try to keep that audience.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't as much of an issue when I was kind of swapping styles to start working on Choo Choo Charles, because again, I didn't really have an audience. I didn't, you know, there were a handful of people, but not enough to push a game as far as I was trying to push it. So yeah, it wasn't something that I was thinking about too much then.
This is a little bit of a pivot. I was just thinking, you do really interesting devlog. They're almost like a little bit like Mr. Beast style devlogs. They have like a touch of it, you know. And I was wondering, like, do you have thoughts on? I feel like the problem with devlogs a lot of the time is they attract other game developers, but they don't attract like other people than that. And do you have thoughts on like how to make a devlog that is interesting for like non-game developers, basically?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, it's definitely a big misconception. Most people in the industry will tell you that devlogs are bad marketing because they only appeal to developers, which is only devlogs that only appeal to developers. If you're talking about syntax and you're talking about how you optimized for an extra 10% frame rate or whatever technical stuff it is that we might be into and that we might be proud of, your average 12-year-old probably doesn't care about the coding language that you're using and the specific nuance of like why it's better optimized for this type of game. You know, with my stuff, I try and focus much more on. I try and hone in on very specific topics. You know, so like if I'm adding, you know, like for Choo Choo Charles, when I was adding new guns to the game, I was like, okay, that will make a good devlog. It's flashy, it's interesting, it's the kind of thing that your average gamer is going to be like, okay, cool, yeah, guns. Whoa, look, there's a rocket launcher. That's so talking about specific topics that are flashier, that are more interesting, more visual. Stuff like that tends to be a lot more engaging, as well as any topic that you can implement some sort of a story structure into. If there were certain bugs and challenges that you had during development that you can turn into more of a story to make it more engaging, then that kind of stuff definitely broadens the appeal past, just your general game developer base.
Is there like a structure you use for videos? I guess like repeated, like, do you outline them and like make sure you hit like, oh, I need like 5 conflicts, I guess, to work through or something? Like, does that exist, or do you just kind of like feel it out, I guess, in the edit?
Yes. Yeah. So that definitely exists. So I've got a template that I use. And the basic rundown so I'll give a quick rundown of how the YouTube algorithm works. Basically, the videos that YouTube promotes are videos that are going to keep people on the platform for as long as possible. So that means content that has high click-through rates, right? So when people see a thumbnail, what percentage of them are going to click on it and start watching? And then what is the average view duration and the view length, right? So YouTube wants everybody to click on your video and watch a long video for a long period of time. That keeps people on the platform, it keeps advertisers making money, or it keeps YouTube making money from advertisers, and that's when they're going to push your content. So in order to up that retention, the biggest thing that you need is conflict and resolution of a conflict and progress, clear visual progress towards the resolution of that conflict. So I start out my videos, within the first 5 seconds, I'm outlining the full general look at, like, okay, what am I doing in this video? Okay, today I'm adding, I don't know, 5 weapons to my game, or whatever it might be. And then in the next 15 seconds, I'm going to try and give people a little bit of extra context, just enough context to know what it is that I'm talking about, and kind of know, okay, for the past year, I've been working on such and such game, and I need to do this because there are currently no weapons, so there's no way to defeat the enemies, and that's a problem because in a game, you need to be able to defeat the enemies. And then immediately, I start working towards progress towards completing that goal. So that's going to be making new art for the guns. It's going to be adding some particle effects. And then usually around the 1 minute mark, I'm going to try and throw in some kind of a twist or additional conflict that's going to...
I agree.
Some kind of is it louder now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not being too loud, am I?
All good.
Perfect. All right, perfect. So some kind of additional conflict that's going to change how people are interpreting the progress, I guess. And then from that point, from that 1 minute point, essentially everything that I'm doing is I'm just making more progress. I'm reminding people of the overall goal. I am talking about other problems and bugs. One of the mistakes that people oftentimes will make is they'll just give a laundry list of, like, I added this and I added this and I added this and I added this, but without conflict, it's not as interesting. Unless the stuff you're adding is just so insane and out of this world, it's probably not going to keep people engaged. So yeah, conflict is one of the easiest ways to increase engagement, and then just showing people that progress. That's the format.
Thank you. That was very helpful. I guess, like, I'm sure figuring out all the YouTube stuff took up a lot of time to learn. And why did you decide to make like your own videos for the game and make sure those were like very high quality, as opposed to like focusing more on, like, I guess, like, why did you think making a successful YouTube channel was like a worthwhile investment in the first place?
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. So the reason I originally started doing YouTube is because I was just I was trying to find any way to market my games, right? Because I started doing YouTube back my Beautiful Paper Smile days. I started out just making Unreal Engine tutorials. Turns out people don't want to buy your game if you're just making Unreal Engine tutorials. So I started trying to do like other like game development related content, and it wasn't really growing or anything. But the goal was I needed just some way to market my games because I couldn't find anything else that was really working well. So throughout the development of Choo Choo Charles, the main opportunity that I saw, because when it initially went viral, I put out the trailer, it went viral, it got over 100,000 wish lists within the first month or so. So it's like I had a decent fan base for the game already, but I didn't have funding. So that was a big issue for me. I didn't have funding, and I really didn't want to get a publisher involved. So when I saw all the virality that it was getting, I saw that as an opportunity to try and restart my YouTube channel, do more devlogs, hopefully keep a little bit of hype and kind of keep people up to date and try and keep the existing fan base that I had just randomly grown all of a sudden, try and keep them engaged, but also as a way to hopefully get the game funded through ad revenue and sponsorships and things like that, which ended up working out pretty well. So that was the main thing. Yeah.
Going to be a really hard pivot to business talk, but could you talk a bit about dealing with publishers? And like, I mean, you were approached by publishers probably immediately after Cuffbust. And as soon as Choo Choo Charles started to go viral, like, were you approached by just tons of publishers wanting a little piece of that?
Yes. Yeah. So I heard from a lot more publishers for Choo Choo Charles than I have for Cuffbust. For Cuffbust, I've heard more from investors, which has been interesting. But yeah, so for Choo Choo Charles, lots of publishers, lots of the big names that you've probably heard of. But it's one of these things where, you know, by the time that any of them were reaching out, the game already had well over 100,000 wish lists. I'm sitting here like, I know that this game is going to make money when it releases. All that I need to do is get it past the finish line. Why would I give 50% of my revenue if, you know, because I didn't even need that much funding. You know, like let's say I get $50,000 in funding, and then I know that I'm going to be paying perhaps hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in royalties to a publisher. It just didn't make sense. So it was something that I just wanted to avoid as much as possible in any way that I could.
In addition to like the financial incentives of not having to answer to publishers, do you think it also had something to do with like just the brand of Two Star Games and like just being a solo dev? And there's been a lot of controversy over the last couple of years about like what is indie, who's considered indie, physically with the Game Awards. But was that part of the consideration? It was like, well, if I have a publisher and I'm funded, like, am I still indie? And is that part of the story important to the brand that you're building with your projects?
Definitely wasn't a consideration. No.
No further questions.
Pretty much.
But on the same topic of like doing it yourself, since that wasn't a consideration, had you ever considered outsourcing like the social media aspects just to give you more time on development? If that would have been possible at the time, would you have gotten like a content writer or editor or somebody to like just take a bit of the load off of personality? I know a couple of people that have dedicated social media and marketing days, like every Friday from noon till midnight is just pre-writing tweets, recording screenshots and all the things that they're going to share out for the rest of the week, just to take that kind of mindset out of the normal day-to-day dev cycle and just drive hard on the social aspect of it so they don't have to worry about it and they can just focus in and crunch. Has that ever appealed to you to sort of offload some of that?
Yeah, so like I have an editor now for the YouTube channel, but at the time, and I mean even now, but for Choo Choo Charles, I spent very little time on the YouTube channel. I think throughout I think it was about 14, 15 months of development, maybe 1 month maybe 1 month worth of time went to marketing activities. So making and editing devlogs, doing social media posts and stuff like that. So it was relatively little time. You know, I would make a devlog in maybe 3 or 4 days. So it was pretty quick. And I would only put out a devlog maybe once every month or two. And then at a certain point, once, you know, the game had hundreds of thousands of wish lists and I was getting kind of close to finishing the game, I had enough funding to finish it and get it, you know, translated and get voice acting and things like that. Once I kind of got to that point, I pretty much backed off of the marketing stuff entirely. And I went almost silent, except for a handful of Twitter posts here and there for probably 5 or 6 months until the final kind of release push. So it's, yeah, it's like if the game happens to be viral enough, then the marketing stuff, it gets pretty simple. It's not something that you necessarily have to spend a lot of time on.
Is it a similar case for that sort of approach you might take when looking at things like porting, like actual development sides or like localization? You see that is as like being similar to like the content creation side as in the terms that it's not like core dev, it's sort of like supporting development. Not to say the marketing isn't core dev, it's super essential as we see. But is it something that you would want to set as like a lower priority to give you more time to focus? Like I know that you outsourced the porting development work for Choo Choo Charles. Are you going to do the same thing for Cuffbust, or do you want to try to internalize that part this time around?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, when it comes to porting, yeah, definitely was worth outsourcing that for Choo Choo Charles. For Cuffbust, I'm not going to be porting it. I've got other features that I'm adding, like a level editor, which is the main thing that I'm outsourcing right now. Actually, I'm going to be doing a Steam Workshop integrated level editor. So that I've got a co-development studio working on. But because of that, since it's integrated into Steam, it wouldn't work on consoles. We would need to do a bunch of other random stuff in order to get it working on consoles. And then, also with this game, I want to try and support it for longer after launch, with not quite in a live service way, but more so just content updates after launch. And when dealing with console certification and all that stuff, that's a pain to try and do that for like a weekly or bi-weekly sort of update. So, yeah.
Could you talk about like the process of hiring people and like how much time do you spend like when you bring on the editor, the contract developers? Like, did you have to spend a lot of time like teaching them how you go about doing things, or was it fairly seamless, I guess?
Kind of depends. So for the editor, I've been working with him for a couple months and it's been pretty seamless. After we finish a video, I'll hop on a call with them and we'll discuss, things that I think went really well, things that didn't go as well, things to try on the next video, stuff like that. And so that's been going pretty well. With the Codev studio, we just had our kickoff call this Monday. So we'll see how things go with that and what the time commitment looks like there.
How are we doing on time? Should we maybe get to some Q&A?
If you want, yeah, you can ask them in there. Yeah,
Okay.
it's 8:35.
Okay. Let's talk technical. Why Unreal Engine?
I'm pretty bad with the technical stuff here.
Is it because it gives you so much free stuff?
I mean, that's nice. That's a plus for me. Unreal Engine. Okay. So when I was like 13 and started using Unreal, I was being stupid. I was like, wow, look at the crazy AAA graphics. I'm going to make a game with crazy AAA graphics. So I need to use Unreal. I didn't really end up utilizing much of that stuff at 13 or even now. So
is it UDK back then, or was that?
No, it was Unreal 4.
Okay.
Yeah, it was somewhat recent. It was right when it became free. That's when I started using it. Also, yeah, because it was free. That was the other big one.
Awesome. So yeah, free engine, free assets. That's a huge head start when you're just deciding to start putting things in a level, making the size of the island, making the scope of the game. Were there any things that Unreal did for you specifically to like help you make a cohesive experience? I know that like all the main assets that you interact with, like the train and obviously Charles, weapons. I noticed a bunch of doors and boxes and stuff that all have this very distinct texture. Was there any like special shader that you would just put on like every asset that came into the game, or was it more just filling out the world organically?
So I guess when it comes to the shaders and stuff, so kind of the process with building out the environment and all of that was I would essentially any asset that was fairly generic, trees, rocks, basic stuff like that, I would just get as an asset because there's not really much point in spending 3 hours making a tree that I could get in 5 minutes. It's basically the same thing. And so then what I would do is I would just take the textures out and I would put them into GIMP. I've got like a little like a digital sketch tablet, and I would just kind of sketchify the textures. And it was a stylization tactic that I was trying to do. It didn't end up working as well as I'd hoped because a lot of the assets all still kind of just looked like normal assets. They didn't look as stylized as I wanted them to originally. And then obviously there were a lot of the custom assets like the trains and Charles that were also kind of the same thing.
Like the choice of GIMP, also free software.
Free, it's all free.
I guess I just had a question about like game design for a multiplayer game. What is I'm figuring it out as I'm talking. I guess like where do you start with a multiplayer game? Like did you start with like thinking about like what the map's gonna look like? Did you have game mechanics first? Or like I know like with Choo Choo Charles you were kind of saying like you kind of came up with the character first, if I'm not. So was Cuffbust like that with like you thought of like the aliens initially, or that's a very open-ended question. So take it however.
Yeah. So in starting, come up with the concept for Cuffbust. So it started out with a lot of market research. So in between finishing Choo Choo Charles and coming up with the idea for Cuffbust, I had 6 months where I was just doing as much research stuff as I could, trying to figure out how to make a game that was, that could go viral post-launch, that could sustain itself for a while, and that would get as high of conversion rates as possible. So multiplayer was one of the things that I settled on, is that multiplayer gives you a way higher ceiling. It's more difficult to get rolling, but it's a higher ceiling. And then it was kind of just a matter of applying as many different, it's kind of a difficult one to get into because it was a large.
Is the map in Cuffbust, is it all hand placed, or are you using like PCG nodes? So any sort of procedural generation of the prison and like where the exit points are?
Yeah, so right now it's all hand placed. There's not really anything procedural, but I will be randomizing a lot of stuff. There will be randomized item drops, random. There are going to be like different locations where like there are certain walls that are weak that lead to like behind the wall areas that you can get through. Like certain things like that will be randomized just for replayability's sake.
The layout of the prison is the same.
It's mostly the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that something that you've considered? Like, hey, if I have unlimited numbers of levels, it's almost a roguelike. You can play as many times as you want.
I guess that's kind of where the level ender comes in. So hopefully some other folks will make
unlimited
cool stuff.
curated levels. I like it.
Yeah, so is your idea like to have almost just like the long tail is like user generated content basically for the game? Or
I think that the user generated content is kind of more of an in-between thing, because as a mostly not exactly a solo developer anymore, right? But as a small team, there's only so much content that I can put out post-launch in a timely fashion, right? Ideally, people are used to like live service stuff where they're getting new content every week. I can't really do new content every week. It might be multiple weeks or months. And so I'm hoping that, you know, the level editor gives people something else to kind of engage with while I'm getting other like major updates out.
Do you have any go-to inspirations for a good level editor? We've seen a couple games like Meet Your Maker come out in the last couple of years, and they've been fairly successful with like a lot of really cool tools. But then you've also got stuff going all the way back to like Halo Forge or Little Big Planet, that most of the content in those games ends up being user generated. Any standout examples that were possibly a favorite?
Probably the main one, and it's not that the level editor that I'll be making is necessarily using a lot of it, but I think like the Super Mario Maker level editor is probably one of the best out there. I think any editors that feel more like a game than a piece of software. So that's kind of my goal with the Cuffbust editor, is just that it feels approachable to players, and not like a piece of software. That's kind of the main goal.
I think I'm out of questions. If we wanted to, some from the audience.
Thanks for sharing. I have two questions. So for Choo Choo Charles, which went viral, do you think the game would have been successful? Maybe not as successful if it wouldn't have. And related, do you think we should consider virality when making a game, or sticking? Yeah.
I mean, yeah, if it hadn't gone viral, it definitely would not be very successful. That's for a start. Yeah. I definitely think, I don't necessarily know that virality should be the main goal. It's a massive goal for me. I think most developers should be mostly focused on marketability. You know, the market research, making sure that you're adding, you know, ideally, you've got mechanics in your game that are visually appealing, right? There's a lot of games that they're perfectly fun to play. You know, you sit down and you play a game. It's like, okay, yeah, sure, that was cool. You know, you go to PAX and stuff, and it's like, okay, that was cool. But if I saw a screenshot of this, would I want to play it? You know, being able to have gameplay that can be communicated as instantaneously as possible just through a single screenshot or through a 3-second clip. It's like people should be able to derive as much information as possible about what the game really is and what it would feel like to play, with as little as possible. So I don't know that virality is necessarily the best goal, because it's a complicated thing to try and get right. But marketability is definitely something that everybody should be focused on.
How do you approach your game design? And by that, do you use your experience from like 11 years of development, as in like, oh, I think this feature would be fun based off of my development experience? Or do you try to, again, do the market research to say, or to gather things from other games and say, hey, based on the research that I've done, I feel like this might be more fun for a lot of players?
Yeah, when it comes to game design, I am probably not the best person to ask. You know, I go off of a lot of different random things. You know, I'm trying to think like, okay, what are features that are instinctually appealing? You know, there are a lot of game mechanics that are just instinctually, just the way that humans are wired. They're just really engaging. So I try and implement stuff like that into like the core of the games. You know, at least like the more recent ones, like mostly Cuffbust. For Choo Choo Charles, it wasn't as much of a priority. It's kind of a tough one. It's time, it's iteration, it's kind of just the general game development process. I'm gonna say, oh, this seems like it would be cool. I'll add it in. If people, you know, are playtesting and they agree, then great, I'll keep it. If not, I'm gonna make adjustments and kind of go from there.
How do you get playtesters? Just your process in general. For me, at least, I've taken advantage of the Seattle Indies and had just people play it during a show and tell. But do you have a different approach that you find is helpful?
I mean, honestly, it's just about getting people. I start out with family and friends, just having them try it out early on. And then when I'm getting closer to release, like with Choo Choo Charles, I used a site called gametester.gg, I think. And on there, you can pay however much keys, however many keys you want to have people test on. And then players will fill out a survey and say what they did like, what they didn't like. You can have different survey questions and stuff like that. And so I think I had about 200, 250 testers across a handful of different test groups in the last few months of development as I was kind of wrapping things up. And that was definitely useful.
So on the topic of virality as like a goal or like a way to get awareness on a project, what happens after that? Like, so if your goal is to go viral and say you want to get 100,000, 200,000, 500,000 people eyes on a project, what happens when you actually do go viral, and how do you plan for that? Do you have like a Discord server all spun up and waiting for a fresh 500,000 people to join? What's it like finding moderators for a community that size? Do you have social media posts queued up on channels that are ready for that influx of people, whether it happens or not? And did that go the way that you wanted it to go? And if not, how was that?
Personally, I think the main thing is just having a Steam page. Having a Steam page, trying to get wish lists, that's the main thing. I don't have a Discord server, and I don't plan to ever have a Discord server. Because again, the moderation of it just seems like a nightmare. It's not something that I want to deal with. And I don't think it doesn't, something like a Discord server specifically, you're not going to get more eyes on a game because you have a Discord server. It's simply a place for your existing community to talk about your game. And I don't necessarily see a ton of value in that. I'm sure for a lot of games that is valuable, probably more so for multiplayer stuff. And it's something that might not be like an awful idea, something like Cuffbust, but for Charles, it just didn't seem relevant. Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to capturing the virality, the main thing is just the intention that assuming it goes viral, you've got your calls to action in place, you've got your store page set up, you've got good marketing copy, you're pushing the wish list as much as you can, and trying to funnel it into a specific area. So I think that's kind of the main thing.
So I'm wondering, where did you get the idea for Cuffbust? I know that prison break games are like popular on Roblox and Gmod. Did you like take inspiration from there, or whatever?
Yeah, for sure. So the prison break. Okay, so prison breaks are just a really good concept. It's something that has been proven in a lot of other media. Ultimately, my goal when I was trying to come up with an idea for a new game is I wanted it to be something that was multiplayer, something that was social, something that was replayable, something that had something that would be set up in a way where there was a clear goal, like where you could look at a screenshot and you could see, okay, this is generally what this game is about, and this is kind of how I would play it. And so something that has like clear, kind of pre-established context surrounding it. So if you see a screenshot of a prisoner character running away from a guard and there's prison bars around, you can kind of get an idea of what the game is. So that kind of instant familiarity is something that I was really looking for. And so one day I was just trying to think about concepts, and I thought about, or actually no, what it was is I was on SteamDB. I was looking up stats on some game or another, and I saw that Prison Architect was trending. And I was like, it would be really cool if there was just like a first person game where you could like escape from prisons. Like that would just be really cool. And then I was like, wait a minute, I could just make that. So I kind of put the idea through a bunch of different tests, just trying to think like, okay, has this idea worked in other mediums? And, obviously there are lots of prison break related games and prison related games that have done well, but not quite in the same way that Cuffbust has been done. Cuffbust is more of a casual multiplayer, social, that kind of a thing. And so I felt like there was an opening there that I could fit into really easily.
Cool. Thank you.
I have a question on Choo Choo Charles. So Choo Choo Charles supports multi-platforms. So how was the technical process to support multi-platform? Like, was it challenge, or does Unreal Engine magically do the porting job, or did you need to go through a third-party contractor or company?
Yeah, so for the porting process, so I self-published on consoles, but I hired a studio to port it. So I worked with Warp Digital, and they're the same folks that I'm working with for the level editor on Cuffbust. It took about 6 or 7 months. It was a bit of a process. It's not exactly magical. It definitely took some time. Working with the console platforms was also quite a pain. It was more difficult than I was assuming it would be. Console publishing is kind of one of those things where like I feel like working with a publisher can be useful because it is kind of a pain working with certification and all the different backends and getting everything set up back there. But yeah, it's a process that, if a game is big enough, I don't see why not, as long as it's something that's easy enough to port, single player stuff where you're not adding a lot of content. Obviously multiplayer is a bit more challenging when it comes to porting, but yeah.
All right, steal this again. So with such a big break between the initial PC release and then console porting taking months and then a secondary release, was that like a concern, or how much consideration was going towards whether or not you actually should port if the hook of your game is virality and just having that moment of excitement in that time and capturing that zeitgeist? What were your thoughts on like, okay, it's going to take this long to port it. What's going to happen when we have release 2?
Yeah, so it was something that I was a little bit unsure on. I figured I would probably at least break even, but by the time that it actually released, I was getting a little bit worried as to whether or not it actually what I tried releasing some plushies with Makeship and they didn't even get funded. And I was like, man, hype for this game has died off a lot. I don't even know if the console release is going to go well. It ended up going actually better than I was expecting it to. That being said, I still think, if I had done a simultaneous console and PC launch, I think consoles probably would have made as much as PC or more. Instead, consoles made, I think all consoles combined are maybe like 20% of the game's total revenue. I think that could have been a lot more if they had released, in unison. But it still did pretty well, surprisingly well. I think mostly just through, I don't know if people were just recognizing it on the storefronts. I think it got a decent push from the storefront algorithms. I don't know exactly how it went, but because I had a hard time marketing it that second time around, because it's like it had gone viral, the hype had died down. People were like, oh yeah, we've kind of already seen this before. But it seems like the storefronts pushed it decently well. If I was doing a single player game, I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think in general consoles are good. It just depends on what the game is and how time consuming or expensive it would be to port a particular game.
What are your thoughts on genre fatigue for that space with Five Nights, Indigo Park, Garden of Banban, Poppy Playtime? Are they oversaturating that market now? Do you think there could be another mascot that could be the next Huggy Wuggy, the next Fazbear? Is there space for another one?
Yeah, so there is definitely genre fatigue within that horror space. The horror space, you used to be able to make hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars off of a decent, moderately well-made mascot horror styled game. These days, you have to put in so much more effort into the quality to stand out because everybody's trying to do it now. Pretty much since Garten of Banban, everybody was, because Garten of Banban was kind of the first one that like really boiled everything down. And it was just like, okay, this is the most simplistic, this is the core of this strategy. You got characters, you got the setting, you got all that stuff. And that made it look really approachable to everybody. So everybody hopped in on it. Yeah, I mean, basically anytime that a new subgenre crops up, it's only really going to be viable for a handful of games. You know, like when Vampire Survivors came out, obviously that one was massive. A handful of games follow it, or a lot of games follow it, but only a handful are really actually going to get, you know, decent exposure, because it's not going to be long before, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 games pretty much satisfy all the demand really well. It's like they've done pretty much all the different subtle variations that you can, and now the gameplay concept has basically been utilized. So I think within like the horror space, obviously you can make successful horror games, but you can't necessarily do like, oh, hey, here's a ripoff of Banban, or here's a ripoff of Poppy Playtime. You can't do the same thing anymore. It's got to be something very different. You know, horror genre is still be around, but not quite in that same way. I think that gold rush has kind of passed.
I'm sorry, last one. I guess, do you look at target market? I forget what I'm spacing out on the target market fit, I think. Like, is there a sweet spot for genres where like they're popular and there's like clearly an audience there, but they're not like, so like what you were saying with Vampire Survivors, there's like too many of them at that point and it gets too competitive. Like, do you look for like a middle ground for genres like that, or?
So it's kind of a tough one. I think if the strategy is to find a successful game that's kind of spawning a new genre, it's very, very difficult to try and follow that because you're on a time crunch. Everybody's trying to follow that. So it's okay, who can make the highest quality game as fast as possible, which is just, it seems risky to me. It doesn't seem super viable long term. It doesn't seem like something that's super consistent, because then you also have to wait around for somebody to randomly make a massive hit game that you can copy. When it comes to genre viability, the main things that I'm looking for are more so like with Cuffbust, I wasn't trying to see like, oh, is the prison break genre in gaming popular enough? Because there isn't necessarily a prison break genre. There are prison break related games, and that gave me some confidence that there was sort of some, you know, interest. But the main thing that I was looking at was other indicators, like, okay, these games are really, really big on Roblox. Prison break skits were massive on in like Minecraft on YouTube 10 years ago. You know, there's all the prison break TV shows and stuff like that. So I'm looking more for proof that the concept itself has some level of just innate familiarity just across a wide demographic, and that it's something that hasn't necessarily been exploited fully within the gaming space.